In this video, we're going to talk about Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, or TIPS. I'll explain exactly how TIPS work, how and where to buy TIPS, the advantages and disadvantages to investing in TIPS, and who should be buying TIPS in the first place. So tip the like button on this video and let's get started with how TIPS work. TIPS, or Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, as you might be able to guess from the name, are a type of US government bond. Specifically, they are a type of bond that adjusts based on the CPI, or Consumer Price Index data, in order to protect investors from inflation eating away at the purchasing power of their money. TIPS have a fixed interest rate that's paid semi-annually, or twice per year. The inflation adjustment for TIPS is also made semi-annually, but the way that inflation adjustment is done makes TIPS unique from other types of bonds we've seen in the past. And that's because the inflation adjustment that happens to TIPS is made to the principal value of the bond, not the interest rate that it pays. And because TIPS are adjusted for inflation in this way, it has two positive benefits for the investor. And that is, it protects both the principal value of the bond and the interest payment against inflation. If we take a look at a completely made up example, say we buy $1,000 worth of TIPS with a 5% interest rate, but over the next year, inflation is out of control at a rate of 10%. That means when the inflation adjustment is made to the TIPS that you're holding, the face value of your $1,000 bond will now become $1,100. And while the 5% interest rate on your bond will stay the same, the interest it's paying you will raise because it's now paying 5% interest on $1,100 of principal instead of the original $1,000. And the TIPS interest payments are also paid to you every 6 months in cash. They're not held in the principal of the bond until redemption like we saw with I-bonds. And we also have some flexibility with the TIPS maturities that are offered. You can buy TIPS with 3 different maturity options: 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years. Because TIPS are issued by the US Treasury and backed by the US government, they are extremely low risk. In fact, as long as you hold TIPS to maturity, you are guaranteed to not lose any of the principal you invested into TIPS. Because when TIPS mature, you're either paid the inflation-adjusted face value of the bond or your original principal amount, whichever ends up being higher. When it comes to buying TIPS, we also have another options in that arena as well. The first way you can buy TIPS is straight from the US government via the Treasury Direct website. On Treasury Direct, you can buy TIPS with as little as $100 and in $100 increments. And if you're unfamiliar with how the Treasury Direct website works, in order to buy TIPS there, after you log into your account, you just click over to the Buy Direct tab and click the little radio button that says TIPS. From there, you'll see a list of the TIPS maturities that are available to purchase. Right now, you see I have available 5-year TIPS, which will be issued on December 30th, and 10-year TIPS, which are to be issued on January 31st. The 30-year TIPS aren't an option to purchase right now because the next new issue for those isn't until February. The advantage to buying TIPS on Treasury Direct is you can invest in smaller amounts. The minimum purchase on Treasury Direct is $100, but because those new issue TIPS auctions only happen a few times throughout the year, you'll have to plan your TIPS purchase ahead of time if Treasury Direct is where you want to make your investment. But if you don't want to wait around for Treasury Direct, you can also buy TIPS directly through your stock brokerage. If you want to buy your TIPS in a place like Fidelity or Charles Schwab, you can buy new issues when they're offered there, or you can buy TIPS on the secondary market. When buying TIPS on the secondary market, you're going to be buying TIPS that other people have sold before the maturity date, and you'll be able to effectively choose your own maturity dates. So for example, on the secondary market, you could buy a 5-year TIPS bond that was issued 2 years ago, so in reality, you only have to hold it for 3 more years. Buying either primary or secondary through your stock brokerage is a great option if that's where all the money you have to invest is there, you don't want to deal with the Treasury Direct website, and if you use a stock brokerage that doesn't offer you full access to the bond market, maybe something like M1 Finance or Robinhood, you can still invest in TIPS in those places by buying a TIPS ETF. Popular TIPS ETFs include ticker symbol TIP, which is from iShares, and ticker symbol VTIP, which is from Vanguard. Buying your TIPS in ETF or mutual fund form is a great option if you're going to hold them in your retirement account like a Roth IRA, and it's something you want to continually have as part of your portfolio, and you don't want to deal with renewing as your TIPS mature. The upside to investing directly in TIPS through something like Treasury Direct versus buying it in ETF form is that when you buy direct, you avoid the management fee that comes along with holding a mutual fund or an ETF. So now we know basically how TIPS work and where to buy them. But what are the advantages and disadvantages to investing in tips? And I'm a positive guy, so let's start with the advantages first. And the first and most obvious advantage to investing in tips is that when it adjusts with inflation, you receive the benefit to both your principal and the interest payment you're receiving. Like we mentioned earlier, when that principal value goes up due to the inflation adjustment, the interest rate is then calculated off that new higher principal amount, and you receive the benefit there too. Treasury Inflation Protected Securities are also a very liquid investment as far as fixed income sort of things go. If you buy through Treasury Direct, there's only a minimum of a 45-day holding period, and if you buy through your stock brokerage or ETF, there's none at all. Tips also have flexible maturities, 5, 10, and 30 years, so you're not locked into something super long-term if you don't want to be. Tips are also an income-producing investment. The interest that your tips generate is paid to you in cash twice a year. It's not like an I-bond where the interest payments are paid out twice a year, but they're held within the principal of the bond until you redeem it, and it's not something like a T-bill where there is no interest payment at all and you receive your return on investment when the bond matures. Another advantage to investing in tips is you cannot lose your original investment so long as you hold them to maturity. And like we see with most other government bonds, everything you earn from your tips investment is not subject to any state or local income taxes. So they're just that much more attractive if you happen to live in a high tax state. Now, that is not to say there aren't any disadvantages to investing in tips. And there are some quite significant disadvantages that we have to talk about. The first big disadvantage has to do with that inflation adjustment. And that's because that adjustment to the face value of your bond is treated as taxable income in the year it occurs, even though you're not actually receiving that money as cash. Let me say that again. When the face value of your bond is adjusted upward with inflation, that is counted as taxable income in that year, even though it's not paid to you in cash. This is a big reason why a lot of people who invest in tips choose to do so through a retirement account, like a Roth or traditional IRA. Another disadvantage to investing in tips is that the principal value of your tips can fall below your initial investment amount, and you can lose money on your tips investment if you sell before it matures. This can happen as interest rates rise, the value of the tips you already hold gets lower on the secondary market. That's why I recommend if you're going to invest in tips, hold them to maturity or invest in them through a mutual fund or ETF. Another disadvantage to tips that we gotta talk about is that tips really aren't the best choice if you're looking for income. They generally pay a lower yield than other types of government bonds, so their strong suit really isn't the income they produce, but rather their general inflation protection that they offer you. So with that said, who should invest in tips? As with any bond or fixed income kind of investment, tips are not really for anyone currently looking to build wealth. They are much better suited for someone who's in the position where they're looking to preserve their wealth, or anyone who has an amount of cash they really only care about protecting from the effects of inflation. So if tips don't sound like the right investment for you, you might want to check out another option for your cash, like I have laid out in this video right over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over there.